Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. We're thrilled that you are able to join us. My name is Charles Finlay, and I am the Executive Director of the Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst. I'm so pleased to be joined today by author and award-winning cybersecurity journalist Nicole Perlroth to explore the many issues she raises and discusses in her wonderful book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. Today's event is hosted by the Cybersecure Policy Exchange, an initiative dedicated to advancing innovative policy responses in cybersecurity and digital privacy. The Cybersecure Policy Exchange is an effort of the Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst and the Ryerson Leadership Lab and is supported generously by RBC. Thank you so much to RBC. Before we begin, I'd like to point out some accessibility features for our virtual conversation today. You can access a live transcript of this session by clicking next to the red button that says live in the top left corner of your Zoom screen. You can select the language of your choice by clicking on the language option at the top of the transcription. We'll also be making the recording of today's session available with a transcript. I'd also like to give a land acknowledgement today. We do this as a symbolic restorative act, one among many to follow, part of a wider, ongoing, and urgent reconciliation project here at our university. We are on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty number 13, and the Williams Treaties. We are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations' treaties and to justice for Indigenous peoples generally. Through our work at the Cybersecure Policy Exchange, we hope to do that by amplifying Indigenous voices and ensuring that we are making space to consider the unique realities and digital divides faced by Indigenous persons in Canada. Again, thank you all for being here, and thanks to Nicole for joining us to talk about this just wonderful book. I'll say to everybody who's in attendance, please get your questions ready. Nicole and I will have an opportunity to chat, and then I will ask questions that you can put into the chat function of the call. So please do enter those questions, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. And now just a word of introduction about Nicole. Nicole, as I mentioned, is an award-winning journalist covering cybersecurity and digital espionage for the New York Times. Nicole has reported on a wide range of topics related to these areas, including in-depth reporting of many cybersecurity attacks, the responses of Western governments to these threats, and the new global private sector markets that have emerged where weapons are bought and sold. Nicole is also a regular guest lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And before joining the San Francisco Bureau of the Times in 2011, Nicole was deputy editor at Forbes, where she covered venture capital and web startups. Nicole, this is a fascinating read. We're so happy to have you here to discuss these issues. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And, I didn't know what you meant by land acknowledgement as we were heading into the Zoom, but that was really special. So thank you. That was very cool to be a part of and hear that.
Thank you. It's an important part of of what we do at the university. So thank you. Every chapter of your book holds revelations for both for folks who are casually trying to understand cybersecurity and for experts in the field. And we're just now on the heels of the Colonial Pipeline attack in the United States, which you've also reported on, and which seems to have finally brought home to many of us, probably too late, how serious attacks on critical infrastructure can be. But attacks on critical infrastructure are a subject you write extensively about in the book. You describe how these attacks have evolved and emerged over time to bring us into the present day. I want to get your sense, Nicole, about the trend lines that you're seeing in terms of this kind of attack on critical infrastructure. Are we moving inexorably into a crisis? Are we as concerned as we should be? Should we be more concerned? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was really the benefit of doing the book, was having a moment to pick my head up and look around at all of these sort of digital blazes that I've been running to and from over the last 10 years. And, I don't think very many people in cybersecurity have the luxury of being able to pick their head up from one major attack and seeing what is the through line here. And for me, the through line, there are a few, but let's just start with critical infrastructure, I guess, since that's what the one you flicked at. We have had so many close calls over the last decade, so many. And, the ones that come to mind that feature in the book are the Russia attack on the Petro Rabai Saudi petrochemical facility, where they got it as far as using a 0-day to dismantle the safety locks, those Schneider Electric safety locks at the plant, the very last thing that you have to do before you can trigger an explosion. And I covered that attack, certainly for the Times, but I don't think it resonated with people what we were actually seeing. And what I think we were actually seeing, I don't know if this was, ultimately it was tied back to a Russian graduate research institute. I don't know if that Russian graduate research institute was looking to cause an explosion, but what was clear is they're playing around with capabilities and also playing around with attribution. Russia's certainly been playing around with capabilities in Ukraine. If you talk to people in Ukraine, they'll actually tell you, the people who did the forensics around NotPetya and some of the previous attacks, the attacks that took out the lights and some of the attacks on Ukrainian media organizations, that they think the 2017 attack, the NotPetya attack, that was the most destructive attack of its kind, was actually Russia's way of wiping the slate clean. After a decade of experimentation, testing out one capability here, one capability there, they think NotPetya was their way of wiping all trace of what they had been doing. And then you see them playing around with attribution. When the GRU took out a French television network, they claimed to be ISIS. It was only later that we were able to tie it back to the GRU. When they hit the opening ceremonies at the Olympic Games, we thought it was North Korea because the Olympics that year were in Seoul, but it was the GRU. And again, with the Saudi petrochemical plant, just given that it was a Saudi oil facility and that Iran had launched a series of attacks on Saudi plants, we assumed it was Iran. And only later did we learn it was this Russian graduate research university. So we've seen in real life, in real time, not in a lab, we see Russia testing out these capabilities, for seriously destructive attacks. We've also seen them get into our power plants and breach our nuclear plants, not just in the United States, but some utilities in Canada and across Europe. And my sense, and only when I'd written the book, could you see where this was. So they're basically in our systems. They have the capabilities. They've shown they can dismantle the safety locks. Sure, we patched that, but I'm sure they've developed other capabilities. So what are we waiting for? And just to tie it back to how you framed the question, I don't know if it's going to be Russia proper that pulls the trigger on that attack, because they know that we would turn around and do the same to them. And I think they're more clever than that. And I think we should give them more credit than that. I think if we see an attack of cyber-induced destruction, it will be more along the lines of what we just saw with Colonial Pipeline. It will be a ransomware group, either with encouragement of, enabling from, or direct instruction from Russian intelligence agencies that say, go hit this, critical infrastructure operator. And also, you don't even have to hit the OT systems. You can just take out their IT systems in such a broad way that it's going to force them to shut down the pipeline. And then what do you get? You get all of those wonderful images of Americans panic buying, running out of gas, questioning the administration. What more does Russia want, really? So that's a long-winded way of saying, that is the attack I think we see coming. It's not the one that we've been talking about forever, Russia just detonating something, or North Korea or Iran. It's this 2-layer or 3-layer of plausible deniability, attack that Russia can always say, as Putin said a few years ago, hackers are like artists. They wake up in the morning in a good mood and start painting. We have nothing to do with this.
And I just want to pick up on one of the pieces that you just talked about, which is the pictures of people panicking, the response of the Western democracies. You've talked about this asymmetry, that we are more vulnerable than they are, and that you just, the way you just put it, you know, we hope that there's a deterrence, like the nuclear deterrence, we think, where we can do to them what they're going to do to us, so nobody's going to do this to each other. But you've talked about how there's an asymmetry at play and we're more vulnerable than they are. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we're more vulnerable for a number of reasons. We're more vulnerable because we are a free market economy. So we can't, and also 80%, some people question the statistics, but I think it's roughly accurate, that the vast majority of our critical infrastructure here in the United States, and I assume also in Canada, is owned, operated, secured, maintained by the private sector. And in the United States, the business lobbyists have resisted any effort to get those companies to raise the bar for cybersecurity. There was a serious effort made in 2012. It was killed by lobbyists. All we've had in the meantime are these very watered down, loosey-goosey best practices that come out of these presidential executive orders that essentially just say, try your best to do this, this, and this. We've also been accelerating the digitization of our critical infrastructure at crazy rates. So we are, first of all, we are now one of the most virtualized economies in the world. And we're also the most targeted, arguably, or one of the most targeted. But we're not acting like it. We're not acting like our businesses and our critical infrastructure are under attack every day. These companies are seeing millions of attempts to break into their networks. We're not acting like that. So in some ways, the ransomware attacks on Colonial Pipeline and JBS and some of the others are actually a blessing in disguise, because what they are is the most visual edge of this vast ocean of cyber threats that I have been covering, and I know you've been paying attention to for the last 10 years, but for whatever reason, because people couldn't see it, because they didn't have those powerful images of people lined up at the pump or carne asada going up on the menu or not being able to go get urgent care at hospitals, we've all just kept going about our business. And really my takeaway from this book is, one, I do think the next major conflict will be digital, or at least will have some major digital component. And I think that the country that wins that war will look something like Israel, a digital Israel, call it a digital cyberdome or whatever analogy you want to use. But, a country that can exist, that can have its most critical operations function when it's surrounded by hostile activity or targeted by hostile activity. And right now, we are not that country. We would not win in that situation. And what people in Ukraine told me when I went, who were doing the forensics on these attacks, they said, a couple of weeks after I left, they had a major presidential election. And they said, we would never even think of doing this using fancy ballot marking machines or internet voting. We've been hit bad. But if they come for you, it will be so much worse because you are so much more digitized. And just look at elections. I mean, we're just using so much we're relying on so much software and technology, and the maintenance of our voter rolls relies on technology and the security of those systems. And all of that can and has been breached, but we don't act like it. And in fact, there were some pretty disturbing experiments with internet voting over the pandemic, which is logically, you can understand it, especially for accessibility reasons. But really, when you understand the threat landscape out there, it's just lunacy. We shouldn't do it, but we're not operating with that threat model in mind. And certainly not where I'm based in Silicon Valley, where it's still very much move fast and break things. software eats the world, as Mark Andreessen likes to say from Andreessen Horowitz. He's always talking about software eating the world. We're going to bake software into every single part of our lives. And never, ever, ever do you hear him say the word security or cyber threats or attacks.
Let me just ask you about the election piece, which you just brought up. In Canada, we're heading into probably a federal election at some point relatively soon, bit of a guessing game there. We've got provincial elections coming up within the next 16 months, municipal elections. You write about the 2016 attack on the DNC and that contested election, at least from a cybersecurity perspective. Cut to 2020, a different election, maybe less threat, at least the public narrative is. Are we out of the woods on elections, or are we still in trouble?
No, and I think it was really frustrating to see like multiple worlds collide in the worst way possible during the 2020 election. Russia did not interfere in the United States 2020 election. They did on the disinformation front, but not from a traditional hacking standpoint. But we should never let the lesson be that means our elections were secure. They are not secure. Chris Krebs' team at CISA did yeoman's work trying to get paper backups wherever they could. And, during the pandemic, they had the benefit of having a lot more paper because of so many mailed in ballots and that kind of thing. But we are so far from where we need to be. And where we need to be is, people like Matt Blaze will say risk limiting audits. As long as you can take a small sample of ballots and go back to the people who cast those ballots and say, is this what you meant to do? And they say yes, then okay, then we can assume that for the most part, this was a secure election. And if they say, nope, that's not how I voted, then you have a huge problem on your hands. And hopefully you did a lot of other work in between on defense in depth. But what I worry about is digital disenfranchisement. I mean, you saw in the US election that it just came down to Fulton County and Maricopa County and Philadelphia. And a lot of people, I think, say, well, the US is so decentralized, our elections are so decentralized, no one could actually hack a US election, or certainly they couldn't do it at the scale necessary to change the vote. That's not true. They can just go to Fulton County's voter rolls ahead of the election, take everyone who's marked as registered and change their registration status to unregistered. This is really a US problem, I should say, by the way, because for whatever reason, we don't want people to vote. But you go through and you mark them as unregistered, and then people show up to the polls that day and, they're not registered, and there's no paper record that they showed up at the poll that day. Unless they fill out what is it called, a provisional ballot. But those are the attack scenarios I worry about. And when you think about what happened in 2016, when Russia did get into the voter rolls in so many states, they only siphoned out, some data from Illinois and I think it was Arizona. They didn't massage or manipulate or sabotage it in any way, as far as we know. But what do we think they were doing there? What do we think they were doing there? I think that's all very much arguably a dry run for some future attack. Now, an interesting question is, because there was so much heightened attention to Russian interference going into 2020, and because sort of almost under cover of darkness, did Paul Nakasony's team at Cyber Command start hacking into the Russian grid and hacking into the Internet Research Agency and posting messages saying, we know who you are, you better not hack our elections. Did that shift Russia's strategy from potentially interfering in 2020 to the SolarWinds attack that we're unwinding right now? I don't know. You'd have to be a fly on Putin's wall. But I don't think it was, the elections are so secure, we're going to have to give up and go do this other thing. I think it was, okay, they are watching very closely, and we'd be actually more clever to seize the opportunity when they're all distracted with the election to go do the real business of traditional espionage.
Is there a a line that Russia is not crossing right now for geopolitical reasons? Colonial Pipeline seemed, and maybe we're not thinking about it properly, and help us with that. It seemed to be a Rubicon. It seemed to be a threshold point where something happened in the United States around critical infrastructure. Has a line been crossed in Russia's posture towards the United States in respect of cyber attacks?
Really good question. And I don't know the answer. I mean, when you think about just exactly what happened with Colonial Pipeline, it was a ransomware group that hit the IT systems, and then Colonial shut down the pipeline because they couldn't capture billing information and charge customers downstream. So it's not as if they came for our OT systems directly, but that's why I say a new playbook was created, because it would allow an adversary like Russia, whether they direct their cyber criminals or just sit back and say, well, don't hit the OT systems, because that's above the threshold. But if you hit the IT systems, that might be all it takes to have the same impact. And good for this administration in the United States for sending the president up to that podium and saying the word ransomware. We'd never heard that before. So that's a step forward. And, it's good that they brought it up at the summit. And, I don't know, there's some disagreement about, when Biden said to Putin, how would you feel if your pipeline was taken out? Which, by the way, Russia doesn't have a very diverse economy. And I took that as, we will retaliate and hit your pipeline. And others said, no, that's not what he said. And you're right, that's not what he said. But I don't think he was just saying that as a, how would you feel, Vladimir?
It wasn't a question about his feelings. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm interested in your point about retaliation. One of the themes that comes up in your book and in your reporting is this characteristic of cybersecurity where weapons that governments create and try to deploy fall into the wrong hands and are then used back against us. Talk a little bit about that dynamic. It's a theme that's serious, and is that a controlling problem in terms of cybersecurity responses by the West?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the major milestones there were, not directly, but Stuxnet, just in that it opened up the world's eyes to the potential for code, not just for espionage, but for destruction. And we've never seen a Stuxnet come back and hit us. We did see Stuxnet show up on our computers, but it was so carefully crafted, clearly with lawyers standing behind these coders' shoulders saying, make sure this only executes on this exact configuration of centrifuges at Natanz and nothing else. But that zipped around the world. It hit Chevron, it hit all of these companies throughout Asia. And what it did was allowed everyone to dissect this code and see, whoa, this is what a digital weapon of destruction looks like. And a lot of governments over the last decade since Stuxnet was discovered, most governments now, with the exception of maybe Antarctica, someone added the Vatican to my list recently, are investing in these capabilities, most of them for surveillance and espionage, but some for destruction. That's why you see companies like Revuln pop up that sell zero-day exploits in ICS technology to governments. Clearly, there's a business there. Otherwise, they would go bankrupt. And we don't know who they sell or who they don't sell to. And then there's this sort of slippery slope of that I describe in the book of former NSA hackers, physically relocating to Abu Dhabi and then doing their dirty work on behalf of Abu Dhabi and showing them the way. And then Americans, even Michelle Obama, getting caught in their dragnet. And then there's this sort of other thing, which is every major attack or milestone attack over the last decade has just been a slight variation of the one that came before it. So when you think about, Iran's attack on Saudi Aramco, which before that attack, as far as we knew, they didn't have very many cyber capabilities. And people like Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, who was CIA director when we launched Stuxnet, will fully admit on the record, we did not give Iran enough credit for how quickly they would develop destructive capabilities. And I think we were thinking along the lines of, well, even if they discover this Stuxnet worm, or they called it Olympic Games, it would take another decade for them to develop this capability. They never expected that Iran would turn around with rudimentary wiping code, wipe out data at the world's richest company, and replace it with a image of a burning American flag. And then what happened next? Well, then we saw Sony, wipe out all the data at Sony Pictures, only this time they leaked the data too and embarrassed executives, and people had to resign. And then what happened in 2016? Russia did a hack and leak of the DNC, and it impacted the election and the discourse around the election, and on and on and on. You see that really it is very true that in cyber, the enemy is your best teacher.
And you also talk about, and you just touched on this, about sort of the hubris, the sense in the West that somehow, and this may be gone by now because of what's happened, but certainly for a long time, the United States and Western allies just figured that they had the most important cyber weapons in the world, and they weren't, going to be a victim of other countries that were just less technologically advanced. Turned out not to be true.
That's right. I mean, we did have first mover advantage. And when I talk about this in the book, I go all the way back to the Cold War, talk about learning from the enemy. We learned from an attack on our typewriter system, our typewriters at the US Embassy, where we discovered this very sophisticated Russian implant that was measuring the magnetic disturbance of every key type stroke, and sending, cataloging it, sending it to a radio listening unit that the Soviets had buried in the embassy chimney, that these were the links that our enemy was willing to go to capture our communications in unencrypted form. And that if we did not do the same, if we did not attack every new technology that came on the market, and every piece of technology that the Russians were using, we would probably lose the Cold War, and we'd probably lose whatever war came next. And so that's what spearheaded much of the offensive cyber capability development that we have seen over the past few decades. And it got us, there are real heroes in that story, like Jim Gosler, who got the United States to the place where they could have a first mover advantage in this space. But in this last decade, in this post-Snowden, post-Stuxnet era, when our capabilities have been laid bare for everyone to see, and when our adversaries have recognized that they could never expect to meet our military budgets and spending, but they can do a lot of harm to American businesses using cyber attacks, we are now where we are because of that. Now we are getting hit from so many different directions so frequently, it's become impossible to keep track. Just at the New York Times, from my little perch here, I used to be able to cover every attack. There's no way I can cover every attack. I can't even tell you how many attacks I missed yesterday. Now, the good news is with ransomware is that when I first started covering this beat, most of the attacks we were seeing weren't even attacks. They were Chinese intellectual property theft. And most of the victims were burying them. And so you really didn't know sort of the depth of the problem or the breadth of the problem. Well, ransomware attacks have become really hard to bury because they're not just holding your data hostage and potentially taking your pipeline offline. They're now adding this 1-2 punch of also extorting you and demanding a second ransom to not release your data. And so we're seeing everyone who's getting hit with ransomware on Our Evil's Happy Blog, they call it, where they're posting all of the sensitive data and emails and that kind of thing. And to me, that is in a way, horrible, but also in a way good news, because finally people see that this problem is everywhere. It really is. The best analogy right now is the one that's top of mind for all of us, which is it really is a digital pandemic. It's at this point, it's almost hit everyone in some way, shape, or form. It's just that it hasn't necessarily hit us in the most visceral, life-threatening form yet, but we are getting very close to that.
And let me ask you about one of the pieces that emerges as governments are struggling with trying to respond to this digital pandemic that you raised. You talk about Snowden and you write about Snowden, and obviously the NSA's capture of data. Is there, there's lots of discussion and conversation about risks to civil liberties and risks to democratic freedoms as governments try to respond to the digital pandemic that you've described. Is that a real risk in your view? Is that a serious problem that we need to address, or are we still underreacting to this?
And are you talking about sort of spying on domestic citizens?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, what was interesting to me was, when you read the book, you see I did have this privilege of being able to be in the Snowden closet, the sort of makeshift skiff we set up at the New York Times with the Guardian and ProPublica to go through those Snowden documents. And my takeaway was very different than I think most of the world's and Glenn Greenwald's and others. I wasn't so shocked at the metadata phone call collection program. I was, I think the most harmful thing that came out was to diplomatic relations when it came out that the NSA was spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone and that kind of thing. But when and this is sort of probably very provocative for me to say, but when I watched Keith Alexander's presentation at RSA that year, where he walked everyone through what the phone call metadata collection program was, I think most Americans were left with the wrong impression. I think they were left with the impression that the NSA was spying on listening to every single phone call. And that's not what the NSA was doing. And obviously some of the elements of that program were later deemed illegal. And James Clapper, certainly lied during his testimony to Congress. But to me, the bigger takeaway was what I ended up pursuing with this book project, which was, okay, so the NSA clearly has a back door of some kind into every major technology on the market. And this is American technology, and they're not fixing it. Their first knee-jerk reaction isn't to fix it, it's to exploit it so they can spy on our adversaries. But in the process, they're leaving everyone in the United States and our allies more vulnerable. And what? So we're paying, we taxpayers are paying our government to keep us safe, but in terms of cybersecurity, they're actually we're paying to leave ourselves more vulnerable. That's the dilemma that I couldn't wrap my head around, and that led me to write this book. So that's all to say, in the United States, I worry less about domestic surveillance, although that changed somewhat over the previous administration. Particularly when you see things like the DOJ spying on my colleagues' phone calls and sources. But, when you are a target, like I am, and like some of you are, I'm sure, who are listening to this webinar, that's why you have to take very special precautions. You almost have to assume your government or another government is spying on you. And that's why I take my most sensitive conversations offline and use Signal and put that piece of tape on my webcam and moved my Peloton outside to my deck last week. But where it really comes into play is in countries like, ones you wouldn't immediately think of as repressive regimes, but it turns out they are corruptly abusing spyware, like Mexico. You don't really think of Mexico as a repressive regime. Well, that was a couple of years ago. I describe in the book how I started getting these calls from nutritionists and doctors and consumer rights activists who said, I've read your stories and I've gotten the same text messages. Could I have NSO spyware on my phone? And lo and behold, what did they all have in common? They'd all at one point advocated for a soda tax in Mexico. And someone in government, because NSO only sells its spyware to government agencies, someone in government was probably getting some kickback somewhere along the line and was using government spyware to spy on nutritionists who they deemed a threat to whatever their kickbacks were. That's the problem with this, is even if you have strong oversight controls, these tools are so invisible, there's so little oversight over their use. Policymakers can't really wrap their heads around the technicalities of it, or it's just too intimidating that they don't even want to learn. And then you see these just cases that are ripe for abuse. And what I worry about is, like, what were the chances that these nutritionists would have the wherewithal to call up a journalist at the New York Times and say, hey, I read your story and I think I might have it. I mean, that happens so serendipitously that you have to know that that's happening on a much wider scale in so many other countries beyond Mexico. And, sometimes we get to cover it. But when I ask executives at NSO Group, they'll say, well, we investigate every allegation of abuse. And I say, okay, well, how do you investigate just abuse generally? And they say, well, when you call us. So what? So only when it comes out in the media that your tool has been abused are you going to do a retrospective investigation? That's not very scalable. So yeah, I worry about it a lot, and I worry about the spread of these tools, not really so much as, definitely in Mexico for journalists and such, but where I really focused in the book was Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, where they are really using these tools to make people's lives a living hell.
And you've worked with, in the book, you talk about working with Citizen Lab, our colleagues at the University of Toronto, who have done extraordinary work in identifying tracking by Saudi Arabia and other pieces. I mean, that's just a remarkable report. And take us a little bit into that. I mean, what was it like to uncover those pieces?
Well, some of it was with Citizen Lab and some of it was on my own, but I tell the story of Ahmed Mansour. And, I say in the book that every day, there is not a day that goes by that I don't think about Ahmed Mansour sitting in solitary confinement right now in the UAE and don't just want to scream. I've interviewed him several times. I would even call him a friend at this point. And, here is someone who is in solitary confinement, ostensibly because the monarchy didn't like what he was saying on Twitter. But really, it's because he was advocating for greater enfranchisement. And he has been we call him the $1 million dissident because we found $1 million worth of spyware on his phone. So, the first time I came to meet him was when I was introduced to him through Citizen Lab, when they had found, I believe at that point it was Hacking Team's spyware. I forget the name of that spyware actually, on his phone. And so we met then, and he described how, he'd be somewhere in a parking lot that no one could possibly know he would be in. And then some thugs would show up and beat the crap out of him. And they sent him to the hospital, and they took his passport so he couldn't leave the country. And they started spying on his wife and, intimidating his children. And then I wrote about it. And then what happened was one of my sources showed up at my house one day, made small talk for a little bit, and then said, take pictures of my screen, print them out, delete them from your phone, delete them from your printer, delete them from the cloud. And when he left and I looked at them, these were NSO's, marketing materials and the description of all of their spyware and Pegasus and the pricing and who they were working with. And it was everyone from the UAE to Finland. Which was a shocker at first until you realize who Finland's neighbor is. And I said, okay, I'm going to wait to see if I can find out who these are being used against before I out NSO, because so many times when I had written about Hacking Team, I later learned that my coverage, as negative as it was an advertisement for them, for other countries who were saying, wait a minute, why don't we have this? And it would just create millions more in profits for Hacking Team. So that time I waited. I got a call from Citizen Lab, and they said, we believe we just found some NSO spyware, this Pegasus product, on Ahmed Mansour's phone. And so I covered that. And this time it exploited, was it 1 or 2 zero-day exploits in iOS software? So it was clearly extremely sophisticated. And now he's in jail. So I just, now I'm sort of drifting here, but it's a horror show. It's a horror show.
I want to ask about some intergovernmental pieces. So, and I'll turn here to some questions from the audience, and folks who are watching, please put questions in the chat. We've got some great questions here, and a couple of questions actually about strategies, international strategies to manage this problem, and really asking for your evaluation of international efforts amongst NATO countries, amongst G7 countries around protection of citizens and critical infrastructure. Where would you put that right now? How would you evaluate those efforts?
Well, the story of international cooperation has been a very sad one here in the United States, because the United States position on this is, and it has changed recently. So I'll start with what it has been. What it has been is that we had first mover advantage, that we are, and Five Eyes, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK are all the top dogs in this space. And we don't want to agree to some kind of digital Geneva Convention with parties like China and Russia and even Iran, et cetera, who outsource a lot of their most sensitive operations to, private employees who moonlight for the government after their day jobs at Chinese companies, or in Russia's case to Russian cyber criminals, or in Iran's case to private front companies. So our position has been one very much of realpolitik of we could agree to this treaty, but unfortunately, most of the attacks that come from the United States come out of the NSA or Cyber Command or some of the other intelligence agencies, and the same is true for our Five Eyes partners. And so we can agree to this, but Russia could agree to it too, and then all of the attacks would just come from cyber criminals. So the fact that it doesn't get rid of the safe harbor issue, and we continue to see our adversaries and people like Vladimir Putin, really exploit the safe harbor issue to their advantage. So we don't want to sign on to that. Okay. Well, right now the problem has gotten so bad here in the United States, particularly with ransomware, that you are starting to see the fruits of some other kinds of cooperation. So for instance, I know at the State Department right now, at the US State Department, there is a working group that's set up that's partnered with 20 other countries like Five Eyes and also our allies in Europe to come up with a new strategy, one that says, what are the attacks that are on the table, that are considered on the table, traditional cyber espionage, the kind that the US has been for a very long time doing, and that we will continue to do as long as we exist. And what are the kinds of activities and cyber attacks that are off the table? Is it a supply chain attack like the kind that we just saw with SolarWinds? Is it a supply chain attack that ends in sort of destructive means? Is it a widespread supply chain attack, or is it okay to use Huawei to spy on Iran's foreign ministers because they use Huawei? At what scale is that considered off the table? On ransomware, is that always off the table, or is it just if it hits a critical infrastructure company? These are the questions that are happening right now within the State Department working group. And then there is, okay, if it's off the table, what's on the menu of possible responses? Is it just more of the same of what we've been doing in terms of sanctions or indictments? Or is the situation now such that because we know Russia and China will never extradite its cyber criminals or its members of the PLA or the Ministry of State Security, do we have to go further? Is it a hackback? Can we take that ransomware group's infrastructure offline? Should we leak Vladimir Putin's financials and evidence of corruption among Russia's oligarchy and create 3,000 more Navalny's? These are really interesting conversations, and I know these are the ones playing out inside government right now. And I think, unfortunately, when it's come to cybersecurity, the world is leading by crisis. And if there's any good to come out of the last few crises, it's that these discussions are finally happening. And I don't know what will come out of it. But I do know that this administration, I think, doesn't want to be seen here in the United States as lying down any longer. And And so they want to come up with more aggressive responses. But that brings us back to the point of my book, which is, even if you're the number one offensive player, even if you can, enshrine the Russian grid as a target of a legitimate target for mutually assured digital destruction, what about the fact that we haven't even bothered to lock up our own power companies? What about the fact that our pipeline is so easily dismantled? We can't just keep going offense all the time and throwing stones out of the glassiest house in the world, without seriously locking up our critical infrastructure. And that is the hardest piece, because it's not just a government thing, it's a private business thing, and it's an individual thing, and it's an employee thing, and it's a cyber awareness training thing. And it's on all of us. It's like the pandemic. It's like, at the end of the day, so much of it was government response and vaccine procurement. So much of it was on hospitals and that kind of thing, but so much of it was just on individuals to wear masks and not be idiots about how they expose themselves to the virus. And same in cybersecurity.
Are you optimistic about the large investments? You talked about Israel and sort of that being a kind of country with that sort of commitment to securing its infrastructure that's going to survive these kinds of cybersecurity attacks that may be coming down the line. That kind of a security posture takes an enormous amount of public investment. Are you optimistic about that happening in the United States? Is that something that's going to be politically possible?
No. And whenever I get that question, I think about my time living in Colorado, where just a couple of years ago, I lived in Boulder for a couple of years. And what always stunned me, having grown up in California, was motorcyclists, roving around without helmets on. And they'd push back on any regulation to wear a helmet because freedom. That's how I think it's going to play out in the United States. I think in Israel, they have made they have the advantage of having this. It's not a hypothetical threat. They're constantly surrounded. The countries who've done really well in cybersecurity are Israel, where they've made this trade-off in privacy to allow the Israeli cyber defense to really get into some of these critical private networks and defend them on site, to monitor for real-time threats. We would never do that here, especially after Snowden. And I don't think you would do that in Canada. And I don't think we would see that in maybe like New Zealand or the UK. So, okay, we're not going to do that. Okay, so if it's going to come down to private businesses getting to the point where they can defend themselves or deflect nation state threats, what is that going to take? I think there are some businesses like PG&E that have the resources to hire up, former NSA, former GCHQ, the Canadian equivalent, bring them on site, a blank check to spend in the name of cybersecurity, fancy intrusion detection technology, fancy firewalls, all of it. But for the most part, a lot of our critical water systems are run by mom and pop, local, yokel businesses who don't have the luxury of building up mini intelligence agencies. So, maybe it helps with the cloud now. It's a double-edged sword that they can offload some of their risk to Google and to Amazon Web Services, and maybe that'll get us to a higher bar of security. But right now, so many businesses are just about, freedom and just running their operations from some back office server. And so maybe we'll see those guys change. Maybe they'll say, okay, this isn't working. We're just going to get attacked. We're like low hanging fruit here. And that will change. But it's really interesting for me to look at, at the end of the book, I look at okay, who are the countries who are doing really well? And there was a very interesting study a couple of years ago. It's now sort of out of date, but it's useful. And it looked at the ratio of successful attacks versus total security incidents. And it found that the countries that performed the best in the study were in Scandinavia, where they have very comprehensive national cybersecurity policies And also, they're just as virtualized as we are. But in companies, cyber awareness training is a real thing. It's not just click through this thing. It's the first thing that happens when you join Nokia and some of these other companies is they walk you through how many attack attempts they get every day, what responsibility you have as an employee to help collectively defend the company. They have real carrots and sticks for critical infrastructure operators, and that's why they're so successful. In Japan, similarly, they actually had a very low ratio, but it jumped up quite a bit in a year. And over the year, what happened? They put in place a national cybersecurity policy. They used words like air gapping for the first time in any of these policies. They emphasized cyber hygiene, but in Japan, this is a society that follows the rules. In the United States, we're not known for really wanting to follow the rules or letting, the government dictate our business practices and that kind of thing. So culturally, almost like the pandemic, it's our idea of exceptionalism that will, I think, get in the way for a long time. And so I think here we're in for a period of a lot of short-term pain before we can get the low-hanging fruit to say, okay, at this point, I'll accept that I need to move this up. But, like I said, we tried to legislate these issues. It failed. And here I will say something positive, which is just here in the United States, we had Biden just signed the cyber executive order, where there was a very clever mechanism in there. And it said, we'll cut out the red tape. We'll come up with a list with NIST of a framework for cybersecurity practices. We'll cut out the red tape. You can self-certify that you meet these guidelines. But if you don't meet them and we catch you, or you get hit by a ransomware attack and it turns out it came in because you didn't use two-factor authentication or you hadn't patched your software, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. That's a really powerful stick, because when you think about Colonial Pipeline, here was this massive attack that came down to an employee account that they forgot to disable when the guy left. They didn't have two-factor authentication turned on, and that's how they got in. Well, Colonial Pipeline's a private company that supplies half the gas to the East Coast, but they butt up against federal systems. And if they can't do business with the federal government ever again, it makes them commercially unviable. It would put them out of business. So that's a powerful stick. So I'm glad that we're finally sort of using the power of the purse here. I think it'll be easier for a lot of countries. And, you just think about Japan. Japan and South Korea performed really well on that study, partly from their policy, but also they're surrounded by China and North Korea. So they're living under constant threat. Israel is living under constant threat. Here, we don't feel like we are, but we are. And so that is the mindset that has to change.
Nicole, we're coming close to the end of our time here, and I just want to talk for a second about a couple of pieces of the book. One of the amazing parts of the book is the characters that you encountered and met. And I mean, it's the reporting of it is over years. Talk to us a little bit. Is there a favorite character? I mean, you've mentioned one already, but is there a favorite personality or individual that emerges from this reporting in this extraordinary world that you access for us who comes to mind?
Well, there's no hero. There's no one hero in the book. And the way I tried to structure it was, I knew this was a highly technical topic, but I wanted to write it for my mom, mainly so she could see what I've been up to for the last 10 years. She kept saying, why can't you finish the damn book? And I'm like, it's pretty complicated. But, so every chapter I tried to write around an individual who represented or could represent one slice of the market. And the part where I had the greatest anxiety was, who am I going to get to speak for the US intelligence agencies? And that was really important to me, because I actually thought that one of the missing takeaways from the Snowden documents was around the context. Why are Western intelligence agencies developing this level of capability and attacking these technologies and spying to this level? They deserve a lot of the backlash they got, but what about China? What about what China has been doing? What about what Russia's been doing? What about some of these authoritarian regimes where they were using this for really deadly effect? So I was just like, I really want someone to be able to speak to what the story has been inside US intelligence agencies. And one day I was sitting at my office and I was ruing, like, no one's going to talk to me from the NSA, especially after Snowden. No one's going to talk to a journalist about this stuff. And then my predecessor, John Markoff, walked by and he said, "Oh, you need someone to speak for, US offensive programs. Why don't you just talk to the godfather of American cyber war?" I was like, who the hell is the godfather of American cyber war? It's like, oh, I forget his name, but I'm sure if you Google around and ask around, you can find him. There's this guy, I think he worked at Sandia and then he was at NSA and CIA. So it took about 3 weeks of Googling. And I find this name, Jim Gosler, who met all of those criteria. And I get to go to these conferences and these events at the conferences, and I would use these conversations, where we would talk about other things, but at the end I'd say, now, if you could name one godfather of American cyber war, who would it be? From people like Michael Hayden, and they would say Jim Gosler. And so I cold called Jim Gosler, who was retired and now lives in the Nevada desert, and I said, I'm writing this book about the cyber arms race, and I understand you're the godfather of American cyber war. Will you talk to me? And you would think that the immediate reaction was no, but it turns out that our interests were very much aligned. Here I was writing a book about the spread of these capabilities abroad and the boomerang effect of them on the United States and our allies. And here was someone who was responsible for spearheading a lot of these programs inside NSA and later CIA, and then at Sandia, who is now retired, watching those capabilities boomerang back on us. And he shared the very same sort of general perspective that I did, and was willing to sit down and talk me through it. And he said, we're going to do this in a series of calls, basically, but first I need you to go back and look up this report that's been recently declassified. And I'm the one who helped declassify it. I was the instigator, and it was called Project Gunman. So you can understand why we ended up doing what we did. And that was the story of the typewriters at the American Embassy in Moscow. So I won't say he's sort of like the hero of the book, but, he looks like Santa Claus. And here he is, like the father of cyber war, and really very much a Socratic, professorial type, not the type you would think in the general's uniform, and really took such a holistic view of this whole thing, and isn't just Mr. let's go and hit everything and spy on everything and destroy everything. It's no. I was calling out these vulnerabilities to government because I was worried that one day, our adversaries, first Russia, then China, then Iran, would use these on us. But the sort of impetus and the push within these intelligence agencies we'll use them to exploit our enemies and spy on our enemies, and maybe one day, do it at scale and perhaps for destruction. But he never stopped worrying about what the boomerang effect would be. And so if I had to pick one who I learned the most from, it might be him. And then the rest were, the targets of a lot of these technologies, like Ahmed Mansour, like just everyone I encountered, the journalists, the dissidents, the nutritionists, everyone who could be sort of the canary in the coal mine and say, look, this is what it's like. You're literally living in a virtual cage that no one can see, but I can't go anywhere. I can't even leave my country because I'm caged in by my technology. And yet here you are in the United States, and you're plugging in every element of your lives to it. And so just the dichotomy of those conversations was always so eye-opening, and always so brave of those people to be willing to share those stories with me as they're literally sitting in their home, unable to leave without getting beat up, for speaking out. So, not one, but many.
And thank you for sharing their stories with us. And thank you for spending this time with us this afternoon. This brings us to the end of our conversation. And Nicole, I loved this book. I thought it was absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for bringing it to all of us, and thank you for our discussion. This was a terrific chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I've been watching the chat too, so I'm sorry we didn't get to every question, but hopefully we sort of hit on them in the course of the conversation. But thank you so much for the questions, and let's keep in touch, and hopefully in person, we'll meet one of these days soon.
I really look forward to it. Thank you. And I want to thank everyone who purchased a copy of Nicole's book through our event today. Many of you should have received your copy in the mail already. If you haven't, it's on its way. And as I said, if you haven't got your hands on a copy, do yourself a favor and get one. It is riveting and essential reading. And thank you for everyone, to everyone for joining us. The cybersecurity, as we just talked about, of our public and private systems is one of the most pressing challenges of our time. And we hope you can take some of these conversations that we've had and some of what Nicole's taught us into your own networks and spaces as well. As our world becomes increasingly more digitized, it is critical that we stay informed about the threats that come with technological advancement and the complexities of this deepening cybersecurity crisis. The strength of our democracy depends on it. I want to, just before we leave, note that the Cybersecure Policy Exchange has just released its latest report, which touches on an issue that Nicole talks about in her book. The report is called See Something, Say Something, Coordinating the Disclosure of Security Vulnerabilities in Canada. It is a wonderful report, essential reading. I recommend it to everyone who's listening in, and congratulate the whole team at CPX for putting that report together. So thank you. And thanks again, Nicole, for shedding light on these hidden truths and for being with us today. And many thanks to everyone for your participation. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.